Olá a todos!
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to dive into a topic that's often misunderstood, especially outside of the Latino community. The way we Afro-Latinos use and perceive terms like Negra and Morena. These words are deeply rooted in our culture and carry different meanings depending on where you're from, how they're used, and the history tied to them. As I'm starting this journey on my channel, I want to focus these first few videos on terminology because there's a lot of misconception about what certain words mean within our community. It's easy for people to misunderstand or misinterpret terms when they come from a different cultural background, and this can lead to confusion or even conflict. And for those who are aware, I want to make this a place where we can discuss our experiences. So, let's start by breaking down these terms. Understanding them is key to understanding who we are as Afro-Latinos and how our experiences differ from others within the broader Black diaspora. These words are not as negative as some might think. Let's unpack why. Let's get into it. How we identify ourselves. First off, it's important to recognize that in Latin America, terms like Negra and Morena are commonly used and carry a variety of meanings. Often they are used as terms of endearment. For example, my husband, who is Mexican, calls me Negrita all the time. In our culture, this is an affectionate nickname. It's a sign of love and admiration. There's no negativity attached to it, and it's something that's very common in many Latin American households. In fact, within Latino families, it's typical for relatives to have nicknames based on appearance. You might hear someone called Gordita, Flaca, Chino, or Negra. It's all said with affection and often a reflection of the closeness within families. For us, these words are part of our language of love. So, when someone calls me Negrita, it doesn't hurt. It makes me feel seen and loved by those closest to me. This is a big cultural difference from how African Americans might use the term Black. In my daily life, I don't usually refer to myself as Black. Instead, I'll describe myself as Morena or Negra, depending on the context. This is pretty common among Latinos of African descent, and it reflects the way we see race and identity within our cultural framework. While in the United States, the word Black often carries a strong political and social identity, for us, terms like Negra and Morena can be much more casual and intimate. But that's not to say we're ignoring our African heritage. It's actually quite the opposite. These terms are ways we acknowledge our roots, but through a different lens than the one used in the U.S. For example, when I call myself Negra, I'm not just acknowledging the color of my skin, I'm also embracing my Afro-Latinidad, my history, my culture, personal experiences, and family stories. In Brazil, terms like Negra and Morena are not just descriptors of skin tone, but part of how we interact affectionately with each other. You might hear someone say, Oi, Morena, or Vem cá, Neguinha, and it's all said with warmth and closeness. These terms are often used within families or among friends, and they are not meant to diminish or insult, quite the opposite. In my family, I grew up feeling like these words were a way to highlight the beauty of our Blackness, even if race itself wasn't always explicitly discussed. This brings me to an important point. In my Brazilian upbringing, race wasn't necessarily talked about all the time, even though we clearly understood we were of African descent. Our heritage was something that lived in our traditions, our food, our music, and our family stories, but it wasn't always named outright. It was simply part of who we were, embedded in our culture. This might seem strange to some people, especially in places like the U.S., where race is often front and center in conversations about identity. But growing up, I knew I was Afro-Brazilian without needing to constantly say it. That's something I want you to keep in mind as we talk about how terms like Negra and Morena are used. They are deeply tied to culture and context. Negra and Morena across Latin America. Let's dive into how these terms differ across Latin American countries because the meanings and connotations shift depending on where you are. In Brazil, for example, Negra is a term that many Black women use with pride. You'll hear women say, Eu sou negra, which means I am Black, and it's a way to assert their identity proudly. It's a celebration of their African heritage and often a political statement against colorism and racism. Brazilian culture has a long history of Afro-descended people fighting for recognition and equality, and Negra is a powerful way for them to reclaim their blackness in a positive light. On the other hand, Morena in Brazil can be used to describe someone with a lighter skin tone, someone who is brown or mixed race. It's seen as a more neutral descriptor that doesn't have the same political weight as Negra. But again, context is key. Depending on who is using the word and how it's being used, Morena can carry different layers of meaning. In the Dominican Republic, the use of Negra and Morena shifts slightly. Morena is commonly used to describe someone with a medium or dark brown complexion, while Negra might be reserved for someone with very dark skin. But just like in Brazil, these terms don't carry negative connotations. They're ways of describing the incredible diversity of skin tones in Dominican culture. What's also important to understand is that many Dominicans embrace these terms within the context of their national identity, which sometimes takes precedence over racial identity. In Mexico, you'll see a similar dynamic. Negra can be used as a term of endearment, like in my own relationship, where my husband calls me negrita. And morena is a widely accepted term to describe women with brown or olive skin, often linked to indigenous or mestizo heritage. It's interesting to see how race and skin color in Mexico are often intertwined with discussions of heritage, and words like morena take on multiple meanings. These nuances help show how race and identity are experienced differently across Latin America and how fluid the terms can be based on context. The difference in perception. Here's where it gets interesting and sometimes tricky. In the United States, particularly within the African American community, terms like negra or negro carry a much heavier history. These words were used derogatorily for centuries, often tied to the history of slavery, segregation, and racial violence. So it's understandable why these words can feel offensive to African Americans and why they might not understand how we use them affectionately in our culture. The term negra in English sounds close to negro, a word that was used during segregation and civil rights movements as a slur against Black Americans. For African Americans, those words are tied to pain, and hearing them brings up memories of oppression. But for us Afro-Latinos, those same words don't carry that painful history. They're part of our everyday language and culture, often used with love and pride. It's important to remember that language evolves differently across cultures, and what's offensive in one context can be totally normal or even positive in another. For instance, my cousin once had an African American friend visit her home for dinner, and she was shocked when she heard our aunt call her Minha Negrinha. She thought it was a racial insult and couldn't believe that my cousin responded so casually. She had to explain to her that in our family, and in much of Brazil, negra and negrinha are affectionate terms, not insults. Once she understood the cultural difference, she appreciated the nuance, but it took some time to explain. Identity beyond labels. Another important point to discuss is that not everyone in the Afro-Latino community identifies with terms like negra or morena. Some people prefer to be identified by their ethnic or national background. For example, instead of saying I'm negra, someone might say I'm Brazilian or I'm Dominican, focusing more on their national or ethnic identity rather than their race. This shows just how complex race and identity are in Latin America. For some, race is a core part of their identity. For others, it's less significant than their nationality or culture. This diversity in how we identify reflects the multiplicity of experiences in Latin America. Some people might strongly identify with their Blackness, while others might feel more connected to their heritage, be it Dominican, Colombian, or Venezuelan. And that's perfectly okay. The beauty of identity is that it's personal and unique to each individual. There's no right or wrong way to identify as long as it feels authentic to you. Bridging the gap. So, how do we bridge the gap between these different cultural perspectives? I think it starts with recognizing that words have different meanings in different contexts. When African Americans hear negra or negro, they might immediately associate those words with the painful history tied to them in English. But for us Afro-Latinos, those words are woven into our cultural fabric and are often used with affection, pride, and respect. It's really about mutual respect and understanding. I respect the African American experience and the sensitivity around certain words. I hope that in return others can understand that for us, Negra and Morena are not insults. They're a celebration of who we are and where we come from. It's about embracing the full spectrum of our identities and honoring our cultural heritage. At the end of the day, how we identify and what we call ourselves is deeply personal. Whether you go by Negra, Morena, or prefer to just identify by your ethnic background, what matters most is that you feel proud of who you are. I hope this video helped shed some light on the cultural nuances of these terms and why they mean something different to us in the Latino community. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you use these terms in your community or how your experiences with identity differ. Until next time, stay empowered and keep embracing who you are.
Tchau, até a próxima vez!